Part 1. Opening. The Gilded Showroom Trap. Imagine building a massive castle and throwing a lavish party. People marvel at the grandeur of the estate and the extravagance of the event, gladly paying the admission fee to enter. However, the lord of the castle actually grows poorer with every party hosted. They've entered into a distorted contract. The lord bears the exorbitant maintenance costs and the servants' wages, while the lucrative profits from the expensive wine and food sold at the party are entirely swept away by merchants outside the castle walls. On the surface, the castle's lord appears to wield ultimate power, but in reality, they are merely an expensive, unpaid bodyguard for those merchants. This deceptive feudal contract is perfectly replicated in modern capital markets under the guise of an intentional fragmentation of the value chain. It's a structure where the seller retains the core, profit-generating products, while offloading only the physical space and traffic, which incur massive capex and operating expenses onto the buyer. The market might cheer this on as a fire sale of a global brand, but through an architect's lens, it is a vicious trap of cost shifting. Today, on the Restricted IC feed, we are tearing down not the superficial valuation of the Blue Bottle deal, but the structural blind spots and control mechanisms engineered beneath the surface. Part 2. Structure Breakdown. Hijacking the Blue Bottle Brain. Upon the news of Nestle selling its stake in Blue Bottle, the market fixated solely on the drop in valuation, reminiscing about the glory days of 2017. However, the real structural blind spot gripping the throat of this deal isn't the price tag. It's about which assets are kept and which are transferred. Nestle is not handing over total control of the Blue Bottle brand. They are keeping the highly scalable, high-margin divisions, canned coffee, capsules, and retail bean distribution, securely in their own portfolio. What Centurium Capital is acquiring is strictly the offline retail footprint, which forces them to shoulder the killer rent of prime urban real estate and the premium wages of skilled baristas. This is one of the most intricately designed cost-shifting structures in the history of capitalism. From Nestlé's perspective, Blue Bottle cafes are merely ultra-premium marketing showrooms designed to sell their capsules and coffee beans. As the number of stores grows and foot traffic surges, the brand experience is maximized, directly triggering explosive sales of Nestle products in supermarkets and online. Yet, the massive capital injections and operating deficits required to maintain and expand these showrooms now fall squarely on the buyer, Centurium. Blue Bottle champions extreme craftsmanship. This business model of serving the perfect cup, even at the expense of table turnover, works beautifully for a single store, but it carries a fatal paradox of unit economics, where operating leverage collapses exponentially the moment you attempt to scale. The rate of wage inflation required to maintain that premium positioning outpaces menu price hikes, meaning every new store opened pulls them deeper into a quagmire of deficits. Fundamentally, Blue Bottle's current offline retail operation is in a structural bottleneck. It cannot generate free cash flow on its own and is thoroughly dependent on subsidies. So why is Centurium Capital betting heavy capital to acquire an asset with such a disadvantageous structure? Here enters the buyer's fiercely calculated counter-insight. At the very top of Centurium's portfolio sits Luckin Coffee, which dominates the mainland Chinese coffee market. Luckin Coffee has scaled through extreme telemetry data-driven automation, minimized headcounts, and an ultra-low-cost game of chicken. However, they have hit a growth ceiling, bogged down in a zero-sum competition within China, lacking a ticket to enter the global premium market. Building a high-end category in-house, on par with JDE Peet's or Starbucks Reserve, would consume decades and astronomical branding costs. For Centurium, the Blue Bottle deal isn't just a financial investment. It is a straight cash buyout of the ultimate, overwhelming premium halo, a strategic detour that they can overlay onto Luckin Coffee's massive logistics network and system. While the entry price, discounted nearly in half from the enterprise value Nestle paid in 2017, provides a sort of margin of safety, their true objective lies elsewhere. The plan is to meticulously preserve Blue Bottle's front end, the minimalism and high-end identity experienced by the consumer, while covertly and ruthlessly hijacking the back-end cost structure using Luckin's playbook. They will graft Luckin's highly advanced software and automation modules onto the inventory management, demand forecasting, and bean logistics network behind Blue Bottle's counters. By controlling coffee bean loss rates with data and tracking barista movements via sensors, they will fundamentally block any unnecessary labor deployment. It's the process of creating a mutated hybrid model. On the surface, it looks like the pinnacle of craftsmanship, but behind the scenes, it executes extreme cost control. Through this, Centurium has likely engineered a plan to forcibly flip Blue Bottle's fatal weakness, its negative contribution margin, into positive territory. Top-line growth isn't the core driver of this deal. The key is how to forcefully restore the lost unit economics within a fragmented value chain using the power of data. To survive in this brutal structure where offline and online, showrooms and mass-produced goods are strictly bifurcated, the buyer is extracting the target company's brain and implanting its own control module. This deal is not about selling coffee. It is a scene of ruthless structural redesign, weaponizing logistics networks, the rules of another industry, to rip and replace the internal cost control engine, leaving only the brand's shell. While the market is intoxicated by the aroma of coffee, the architect is calculating variable cost amortization and restructuring the power dynamics of the global F&B market. Part 3. Governing Logic. Rules of the Downside Hedge. Architects structure deals not to make a profit, but to ensure they don't lose a single dime. When a private equity firm acquires a target, the public typically cheers for the exit narrative, how they'll double or triple the top line for a flashy exit. In reality, however, the general partner's true intent is ruthlessly focused on capping the downside, leaning heavily into the downside hedge. The acquisition of Blue Bottle's offline retail is no exception. The fundamental mechanics of this deal aren't built on rosy projections, but woven with cold control mechanisms designed to protect capital in the worst-case scenarios. The reason this structure is so heavily skewed toward downside protection over an exit narrative is because this asset is inherently a cost center spun out of Nestle's value chain, a structural deficit model struggling to generate its own cash. Centurium Capital is acutely aware of this fact, which is why they must construct extreme defensive moats behind their capital deployment. The first line of defense is the insulation of the capital structure, otherwise known as ring fencing. If the Blue Bottle retail entity fails to overcome its massive fixed costs and sustains continuous cash burn, they must preemptively block this insolvency from infecting Centurium's other core portfolios, specifically Luckin Coffee's balance sheet or the overall fund returns. To achieve this, rather than a simple 100% equity play, they will likely engineer a sophisticated capital structure, intricately weaving senior and mezzanine tranches to secure the fund's principal recovery priority, even in a bankruptcy scenario. The second, and perhaps the most critical downside defense mechanism, is likely a risk and profit transfer protocol, hidden within the term sheet with the seller, Nestle. As mentioned earlier, as Blue Bottle's offline stores expand and generate traffic, the true economic fruits flow directly into the top-line growth of the FMCG divisions. Nestle retained canned coffee, capsules, and distributed beans. An architect never lets this distorted free riding slide. As a condition precedent to closing, they must enforce a mechanism tied to the retail store's traffic metrics, or brand awareness retention. This would mandate clawing back a percentage of Nestlé's FMCG revenue as royalties, or securing subsidies from Nestlé to offset a portion of the exorbitant offline maintenance costs. If this cross-licensing or profit-sharing structure isn't set up, the deal would be killed immediately. It would simply be a meaningless exercise in burning one's own capital as kindling to advertise someone else's products. The third mechanism is exit control via governance. Even with 100% operational rights to the offline stores, if the fundamental control over the core Blue Bottle, IP and trademarks remains with the seller, the buyer will face fatal constraints at the time of exit. Imagine 3 to 5 years down the line, after controlling back-end costs to turn the retail operations profitable, we try to sell to a strategic investor like Jabi Holding. If Nestlé rejects the third-party sale citing a conflict with their business strategy or exercises a veto by weaponizing trademark renewals, our valuation evaporates in an instant. Therefore, the architect secures airtight legal control by embedding tag-along rights, robust third-party sale protections, or perpetual IP usage guarantees into the contract, ensuring the seller's change of heart cannot choke off capital recovery. Ultimately, the core governing logic of this structure isn't geared toward how we make money, but rather how we legally reclaim the revenue-generating pipeline surrendered to Nestlé to hedge our downside. No matter how bulletproof the defensive structure appears, deep within any carve-out divestiture lie fatal tripwires waiting to detonate. We refer to these as special issues, the hidden risks behind the business model. Let's deconstruct from a standpoint of prudent skepticism how these structural vulnerabilities can collapse a valuation when they collide with external factors. The first ticking time bomb is the ambush of hidden fixed costs, triggered by the separation. When the target company operated under Nestlé's massive umbrella, it utilized global-scale IT systems, logistics infrastructure, HR, and financial planning, with these back-office costs allocated from headquarters. But the moment it spins out into a strictly independent entity, all this critical survival infrastructure must be rebuilt from scratch using its own capital. There is a highly probable chance that the absence of these shared SG&A expenses was underestimated during superficial due diligence. This would trigger massive, unforeseen cash outflows from day one post-acquisition, instantly tanking whatever fragile margins were cobbled together. An even more chilling risk is that the essence of this business is not coffee, but rather an extreme real estate subleasing business. To maintain its high-end identity, Blue Bottle stubbornly insists on the most expensive ground floor locations in prime global commercial districts. When the macroeconomy enters structural inflation and rents skyrocket, there is a fierce psychological line of resistance from customers against raising coffee prices proportionately by 10% or 20%. The moment the pace of rent hikes and the premium wages paid to baristas outstrips top-line growth, the operating leverage traps the company in a reverse leverage phase that strangles it, leading directly to an immediate working capital depletion crisis. Now, apply a complex stress test where external factors intersect with these intrinsic vulnerabilities. An economic downturn thins consumers' wallets, causing them to turn away from pricey specialty coffee, which crushes foot traffic. To make matters worse, a fatal PMI, post-merger integration, risk arises. A cultural clash between Centurium management, forcing ruthless, Luckin-style data efficiency to improve profitability, and the on-the-ground baristas who treat the extraction time of a single cup as art. If attempts to introduce automation and reduce headcount spark a mass revolt, an exodus of baristas, and the narrative spreads that the aesthetics of slowness have been destroyed, the brand's core equity turns to scrap paper in a matter of days. The fundamental ripple effect of these risks doesn't stop at a short-term hit to earnings. If the experiential value of the retail stores is compromised and offline traffic dies, the sales of blue bottle capsules and RTD beverages that Nestle held onto will also collapse like dominoes. In this scenario, Nestle gains legal justification to refuse license renewals to the store operating entity or impose penalties, citing the degradation of brand equity. The moment the sword of cost control is wielded clumsily, the target company falls into an ultimate, unexitable state where it cannot even utilize its shell trademarks, let alone execute a turnaround. The architect must cold-bloodedly confront this catastrophic chain of causality and preemptively price the butterfly effect triggered by these structural flaws into the most conservative discount rates. Part 4. Syndicate Application. Structure always beats scale. The massive capital chess game between Nestle and Centurium that we've deconstructed so far is not just a league of their own where hundreds of millions of dollars change hands. If you perfectly extract the skeletal logic of this distorted carve-out structure and cutthroat downside control mechanism, even individuals without capital or strategists in entirely different industries can repurpose it as an overwhelming weapon to dominate their own playing field. This is precisely the purpose of our Syndicate application module, to deconstruct and apply the language of finance. If I were to apply this structural logic of blue bottle to a personal deal room or platform building, I would completely eliminate the romantic notion of tying my scarce capital and survival to the glamorous front end that the masses obsess over. When the majority of founders or strategists attempt to build a high-end brand like Blue Bottle, the very first trap they encounter is the collapse of unit economics. To attract a crowd, they lease sophisticated spaces and hire top-tier talent, or when developing an app, they burn massive server and marketing costs while providing the service for free. Leaning on a vague exit narrative that traffic will eventually translate into profit, they burn their own principle as kindling day by day. However, an architect's approach is fundamentally different. Before launching a business, I would first design a structure that, legally and financially, bifurcates the profit center, which generates earnings, from the cost center, which gathers traffic. If I were building an offline-based F&B or retail community, I would tear up the naive income statement that attempts to cover rent and labor costs with the revenue generated from the physical store itself. Instead, I would make that store function exclusively as a marketing showroom that creates an overwhelming brand experience and an intangible luxury halo. And behind the scenes, I would conceal a software subscription model where marginal costs converge to zero, a B2B food distribution network, or a high-margin online product based on intellectual property, IP. The traffic and data of customers visiting the offline store are designed to immediately convert into purchases of this back-end product. The keys here are risk transfer and ring fencing. You strictly isolate the offline entity, which incurs massive fixed costs, from the online IP entity, which generates high margins. If a fatal macroeconomic crisis hits and rent becomes unbearable, you ruthlessly bankrupt the offline entity to sever the tail risk. However, the customer database and the ownership of the high-margin products remain perpetually controlled by the securely protected parent entity outside that shell. It is an individual literally hijacking the exact same ruthless rule of profit transfer that Nestle used to dump Blue Bottle's burdensome physical stores onto Centurium while keeping the fruits of the capsule coffee for itself. Furthermore, let's apply the cost structure hijacking logic, where Centurium attempts to implant Luckin Coffee's telemetry into Blue Bottle to an individual's micro-GP strategy. The only way an undercapitalized individual can defeat the incumbents of an established industry is not by compromising the quality of the front end, but by reducing back-end variable costs through AI and automation, thereby collapsing the fundamental difference in weight classes. For instance, if you run a boutique design agency or software studio, the deliverables you present to the client, the front end, must take the form of extreme craftsmanship and high-end, bespoke consulting. Only then can you secure high pricing power. However, the behind-the-scenes workflow used to produce those results, the back end, must be a thoroughly modularized, cold, and non-human automated factory, consisting solely of AI agents and no-code tools. On the surface, it looks like a blue bottle hand-drip coffee crafted by dozens of experts. But in reality, it is a structure where a single operator flips a switch using a Luckin-style algorithm. This is the architect's secret to avoiding the swamp of unit economics while exponentially exploding operating leverage. The same applies at the negotiation table. If you have to yield the traffic of your space, platform, or community to someone else, never settle for a simple one-off payment or fixed revenue. You must reverse engineer the future value your traffic will create within their ecosystem and enforce a mechanism that claws back a certain percentage of the profits generated in their pipeline as a perpetual royalty. If the counterparty's business grows on top of your framework, you must engrave a structural straw into the term sheet that automatically siphons off the fruits of that growth. Even without capital, if you secure the logical high ground, control of the board shifts to you. Structure beats scale. Part 5. Closing. Beyond consumption, into the realm of structure. The Blue Bottle deal is not merely the changing of hands of a global coffee brand. This deal reveals the bare face of cost shifting, where mega capital thoroughly fragments the value chain to dump losses on others while monopolizing the profit pipeline, and it serves as an extreme structural testing ground, attempting to forcefully turn around negative unit economics through data and automation. Understanding the structure won't grant you entry into the massive global F and B cartels like Nestle or JAB Holding. Instead, by understanding the structure, you can design your own syndicate. We are not consumers of information. We are structural architects. We do not stand at the door. We design the door. Structure Syndicate, Restricted IC Feed, End.